Folks, and welcome to today's webinar, a conversation with three how housing wealth has influenced their practices. We're excited to have you on the call. I'm Don Graves. I'm going to be the facilitator of this conversation. I'm an adjunct instructor at the American College for Financial Services. I'm the president of the Housing Wealth Institute. I'm a charter member of the Funding Longevity Task Force, but 19 years I've been a practitioner of reverse mortgages. The panelists with me today, and I'll introduce them again later. Here's a quick introduction. Curtis Cloak, it's a good friend of mine. Jim Hefner, a super friend of mine. And Marshall Lipsum is like my second brother, a brother from another mother. I like to call Marshall. Good friends. You'll hear from them in just a moment. I'll give a further introduction. But I want to start with the housing wealth overview because I do not assume that everybody on the call has some of the particulars about reverse mortgages and housing wealth. So I'm going to cover a few things in about 5 or 6 minutes, and then we're going to turn this call over, and I'll begin asking some questions to the panelists. Now, in between the questions, I may cover a few things and a few slides that sets us up for the next question, so we won't miss anything. In this brief overview, I've done a whole course. It's recorded there at the American College. You can see this course in its entirety, 60 minutes. I'm condensing it to 5 minutes, but you can go to housingwealthminicourse.com and see me and get the workbook for free, and won't cost you anything today. So retirement for many folk is the metaphor of climbing a mountain. As you go up the mountain, that's the allocation phase. Pre-retirement, you're diversifying your holdings, you're working to get to the mountain, you take your stance, you plant your flag, and you prepare for the way down. But like many people, the mountain was a little higher than you first anticipated. So it has to go a little higher, save a little more, work a little longer, and now you're coming down the mountain, the distribution phase of the income allocation, and frankly, that's where the danger really starts. The American College has identified 18 major risks in retirement, 18 ways to really lose it all. We won't cover all of those, but it's important to understand longevity risk, inflation, excessive withdrawal risk sequence, and all the other 18 ways to lose it all. So the discipline that many of us are focused on now has moved from retirement planning to retirement income planning, a term that really didn't exist until about 7 years ago. Now, the face of retirement income planning are these folks on the screen right now. Many of you know them. Somebody said, yes, Don, that's the Rolling Stones. And I say, no, no, that's the Strolling Bones, because they're really old right now. Really the face of the baby boomers, 10,000 a day turning 70 and a half, the largest transfer of wealth from qualified plans to Uncle Sam and then to their accounts is happening now. They're going to live longer. They've not saved enough. The majority of them are going to carry some sort of mortgage-related debt. But here's the good news and the bad news about the boomers. 87% own a home, 87% own a home, but up to 68% will be carrying a mortgage, home equity loan, second mortgage, home equity line of credit, into retirement. That is substantial. CNBC had an article, and Jamie Hopkins at the American College, I love the quote, said retirees/advisors simply cannot afford to continue to ignore home equity as an income source and still meet their clients' retirement goals. The U.S. Census Bureau looked at the average retiring couple today and says they're going to have less than $100,000 in savings, but about $192,000 in home equity. Simply stated, folks, housing wealth is too big to be ignored. The typical advisor has 3 buckets to work with: the client's income, their investments and insurances, and we're including annuities in the insurance side. And out of that, they've got to come up with a distribution plan that's either systematic withdrawal, bucketing, flooring, or any type of hybrid ways, but they have those 3 buckets. The question today is what happens when you add housing wealth to the income, investment, and insurances? Does that give the advisor any advantage? Or simply stated, how does housing wealth and retirement savings work together to enhance retirement outcomes and client satisfaction? And so that's kind of the landscape. Let me cover a little bit of the fact pattern about reverse mortgages. 4 words that will help you not get stabbed at the family reunion or July 4th barbecue. You ever mention reverse mortgages at a family gathering and see what happens? It can get pretty dangerous if you're not careful. Let me give you 4 words that have helped many an advisor. It's just a mortgage. It's just a mortgage. The home equity conversion mortgage, that's its legal name, is 30 years old in February of this year, 2018. It's a federally insured loan for those aged 62 years or better that allows them to convert a portion of their home's value and turn it into tax-free dollars. without having to make any monthly loan payments. You don't give up ownership or come off title, and you'll never be required to repay more than the home is worth. At least one person must be age 62 in order to do this. One spouse must be age 62. The other only has to be of legal age, 18. It must be your primary residence. One of the questions that often comes up, Don, is there an ideal borrower? I think what you're going to hear today when Jim and Marshall and Curtis get on the phone is no, there's no ideal borrower. For many years, it was the House Rich Cash Poor, AARP, had a video, VHS, that started out, if you consider yourself house rich but cash poor, a reverse mortgage could be for you. Well, that really took hold, but that was not the profile. So the profile goes across the spectrum. The constrained, that's house rich, cash poor, concerned, cautious, comfortable, and even carefree. I had an advisor from a large firm call me. He said, Don, I've got a client. They've got a retired CEO of a large multinational pharmaceutical company. They live in a home that's worth $4.5 million in Stone Harbor, New Jersey. They've got $5 million in assets under management, and they keep talking to me about a reverse mortgage. And so here's someone that certainly represented a person who was carefree, but when you understood why they were looking at it, they were anything but. And so we'll cover that. If you remind me, I'll tell you how that story ended. The amount of money you get from a reverse mortgage is based off of 3 building blocks: the age of the youngest borrower, the value of the home, up to the lending limit, $676,350, and the interest rate associated with the program. It must be a first mortgage. And right now, a 70-year-old, somewhere at 68 to 70-year-olds, getting about 40% of the value of the property. That's today. They can have it in a lump sum, a line of credit, or monthly payments. And the loan gets repaid when the last surviving borrower permanently departs the home. At that time, whatever money was advanced to them, plus any accrued interest should they have not made a payment, gets repaid. And 100% of all remaining equity is passed on to the heirs or the estate. And that's what a reverse mortgage is, folks. It's just a mortgage. Now, everything I usually say in 1 hour, I said in 5 minutes, so we can get to the main part, the juicy part, right? And that's having my guest here, Curtis Cloak. I met Curtis 3 or 4 years ago. I was introduced to him. He invited me to come up to Thrive University. And guys, you can take yourself off of mute now. And Curtis is just a super guy. We've done a lot together. We were at the San Diego Zoo a few weeks ago, and we rode some sort of bus deal and had a super time. Jim Hefner, I met through Curtis Cloak. Jim's down in North Carolina. He's a CFP and a certified tax specialist, and he's a master elite advisor and all the things on the screen there. But you know what I love about Jim is progressive in his thinking. When he first heard about reverse mortgages and housing wealth, he asked to hear more, he learned more, and he began to incorporate it into his practice. And Marshall Lipson, well, retired, that's why he's in that shirt there. He doesn't have a suit on because every day is a weekend for Marshall. He's the past managing director of the Society of Financial Service Professionals, and he was responsible, one of his things, is setting up continuing education for tens of thousands of advisors across the country. He and his wife actually did a reverse mortgage. And so these 3 gentlemen are on the call. Curtis, are you there?
I'm here.
All right. Jim Hefner, are you there?
I'm here.
All right. And Marshall Lipson, are you there?
Well, if I pull myself away from the pool, I'm here.
Yeah. Put the Mai Tai down and come on and join the conference call here. I had an opportunity on the screen. You see Curtis and I just summarized we were sitting out there. I've lost 40 pounds since then. So you ever look at your old fat pictures? I won't say that to Curtis in particular because he's smaller too. But did a wonderful video with Curtis. The advisors have a responsibility to speak about housing wealth. We'll get that to you after this call. And there's Marshall and I. Why this financial professional chose a reverse mortgage for his family. These guys will be talking about that. So let's start with the first question. Now, the way this is, we'll ask a question, and then I'll unpack a little bit, then I'll ask a second question, and then there'll be some specific questions I'll ask to them. And then if you have a question over here on the right-hand side of your panel, there's a place for you to chat or ask a question. We'll get to that, and we're going to cover all of your questions. So let's begin. Marshall and Curtis and Jim, when did you first discover reverse mortgages as a planning tool, and what surprised you the most about them?
So would you like me to start?
Yeah, we'll start with Curtis, and then we'll do Marshall, and then Jim in that order.
Okay. Yeah, so I remember it was very clearly getting a phone call from Professor David Littell from the American College. I had worked extensively with him, Wade Pfau, and Jamie Hopkins at the college in developing my elements, the retirement income floor elements related to the RACP, and also became an adjunct to do the summary classes around the country for the college on behalf of the college and institutions, and was also requested by David to take the course as an advisor myself and have the credentialing behind my name. And after it was over, David realized that I really didn't focus on the housing wealth section, and he wanted me very badly to meet Don Grace and listen to what Don had to say. So I reached out to Don, and I remember the day that I did that, Don said, well, as a matter of fact, Curtis, I've been following you for several months and was just on your website, been looking to talk to you for a while, so thanks for calling. And I invited him to come to Chicago to attend a Thrive U, and I give him 30 minutes over lunch hour to present, not really thinking that I was going to learn a whole lot. And I'll never forget the first 10 minutes of Don's presentation. I realized that I didn't know what I didn't know. I was one of those advisors that chose to ignore and had dismissed this as something not applicable to me or my clients. And I was really wrong. And in fact, in some situations, I have found clients who had overspent or had some unusual things that would happen they didn't expect in retirement, didn't plan well, have had to tap into housing wealth and had to refer clients to Don, another licensed specialist, because it was the solution for them. I wouldn't have had a solution without considering housing wealth. So that's my introduction into what I now do know.
Thank you. Marshall and Jim, how did you first discover reverse mortgages as a planning tool?
Well, as you said in the introduction of me, I developed educational programming for the profession, and some 12, 13 years ago, we did a program about a retiree and where could they afford to retire, and we looked at reverse mortgages at that time. They were new to all of us in that planning program, and we did a little bit of research on it, but I was far away from retiring, so it was just another program I did. When I came to retire and looking at retirement, which I did 2 years ago, my son, who was my financial advisor, came to me and said, boy, have I got a great idea for you. And he introduced me to reverse mortgages as a use tool, not as a learning tool. And as he went through all the benefits of it, I just got blown away by it. And as I said to you once before, Don, it was almost like I couldn't climb over his back fast enough to find out more about it, because once he got into it, I knew that it was something I needed to look at very seriously. So my introduction to it was when I was trying to make my own decisions about financial planning for me upon my retirement.
And later in the call, Marshall, you're going to tell us some specifics about you and your wife and how you used it. So thank you for that. Jim, how did you first discover it, and what surprised you the most?
Don, I'm not sure. I've always liked the idea of reverse mortgages. Just the concept to me makes sense. But then I'm somebody who really likes mortgages. I'm somebody who likes real estate as investment. So I'm comfortable with mortgages. And I find that often is in contrast to my clients who say the first thing they want to do when they retire is pull money out of their IRA and pay off their mortgage. And I'm thinking, well, gosh, let's rethink this. So I'm somebody who believes in leverage. And, you know, most of my clients have one thing in common. They may have other goals, but their prime goal is to spend as much money as they possibly can. And I find that a reverse mortgage does that. Now, I didn't talk much about it until I met you at one of Curtis's Thrive universities. And I actually learned enough, I think, to be able to talk about them. Now, I'm not an expert by any means, but I do recommend that many of my clients do consider them. And what surprised me most about learning about them is the increase in the borrowable amount of the mortgage. And to me, that is an equity protection tool that somebody who doesn't need the cash now might use that growing equity line of credit, so to speak, to tap into later on in case the market should fall. It's just a defense that we all might want to consider having.
Fantastic. And excellent. And let me circle back. Jim, you're a certified financial planner, and Curtis, you've got a bunch of designations. You guys have more letters behind your name than in your name, and so we're going to talk about that a little later, because those on the call are really saying, well, if I'm a fee only or this, when we get to the compliance section, I want you to talk more about that. One of the things that comes up, I was at the Arizona Institute a few years ago, and I spoke, and a fellow wrote me this email because I sent out some follow-up information, and there may be people on the call with this sentiment, and what you just heard Jim and Curtis and Marshall talk about. He said, Don, we've done a lot of research, we've advised a lot of people, and we don't think a reverse mortgage is a prudent strategy for any of our clients. And I'm glad a lot of that sentiment is changing, but 3 questions that come up, and that will lead to my next question to the advisors here. But the question I typically ask those on the call, and I'm going to ask Marshall and Jim and Curtis to answer this from your old perspective, not your enlightened perspective, but your old perspective. What percentage of your clients who are at or in retirement did you think would have a need for a reverse mortgage, your old perspective? What percentage would you have said, Curtis, Jim, and Marshall?
This Curtis, I would have said less than 10%.
Okay. And Jim?
Jim, so here, I would have said that very few, because I don't really have many clients. Do I want to attract many clients who have such few assets they might need to spend them all? Right. So my goal is to have the $1 million client, not the guy who's going to spend every penny. And it's clear that there's real value for not just the guy who's going broke, but anyone.
But in your these are questions so that you got to go to old Jim and old Curtis, yeah. And I'll withhold from Marshall. And so that's normally what I get when I ask folk, hey, what percentage of your clients, say that again, was that Marshall?
John, this is Marshall. I really can answer that because I work with all the advisors. And
okay, great.
As I said, when I go back to that 12 years ago when we did the first program where we talked about reverse mortgages, I couldn't find an advisor that knew much about it. And so what we did was we asked somebody to do it who I knew and do research on it. So my answer would be 12, 13, 14 years ago, probably close to 0 to 10% at the most, because like I said, I looked all over the country to find somebody who had any expertise in reverse mortgages. So my perspective of what I saw was very few people would have done it because very few advisors knew about it or talked about it.
Sure. And that's normally what I get. The answer that, Don, I don't know, 5, 10% of my clients would need a reverse mortgage, and I ask people to be honest. The second question, and I will not ask the panel to answer this, but I ask this every time I speak, is what percentage of those clients would say they're 100% certain they'll have a great retirement? And typically, I said, not what you feel as the advisor, but what your client feels. And usually that's a pretty small number, 5 or 10%, and you may feel different as advisor, but there's uncertainty. Now here's the final question. And I think we all will answer this the same. If there was a strategy, I asked, that could help those clients increase their cash flow, reduce their risks, preserve assets, improve liquidity, or even add new savings back to retirement, what percent of your clients would want you to tell them about it? Now, the obvious answer is 100%. Who wouldn't want to know about increased cash flow, reducing risk, preserving assets, improving liquidity, and adding new savings? And so there's the impasse that we have even today, is that many advisors say, Don, I don't know, 5, 10% of my clients would have a need for a reverse mortgage. But they just answered that 100% of their clients would want them to would want them to share what a reverse mortgage does. And that's those 5 things. So the question to the panel now is based off of this here. How has housing wealth led to more significant planning conversations that you're having? Conversations around improving your client's cash flow, reducing risk, improving liquidity, increasing tax efficiencies, X, Y, and Z. How has housing wealth led you to have more significant planning conversations? I'll start with Jim, and then Marshall, if you want to chime in, and Curtis. So Jim, Marshall, and Curtis.
Well, I would think it's fairly obvious that where I would start and where I used to start, of course, is just those people who have an obvious need, where it's going to be clear that without a reverse mortgage, without touching that equity, accessing the equity in their home, they might have less than they want or need to have. But I think the opportunities here are to, which is what I'm trying to do, become a complete planner for my clients and not just a product salesperson. That means having plans that really can help my client accomplish their goals with much greater predictability. So when we can use that wealth for other tools, then or other opportunities, it makes a big difference. I think it helps my client see me as a planner, for sure. And it, of course, one of the real pleasures here, I think if someone does reverse mortgage, I'm much more comfortable with the pressures now off me, that they won't be impoverished down the road and looking for me for solutions that I won't have.
Thank you. Marshall, then Curtis.
Well, I'll just jump in for a quick second because I agree with what was just said, with what Jim said. My observation is that more people are talking about it because the follow-up program that we did some 3 or 4 years ago that Curtis was involved with one of the major topics was reverse mortgages. And so clearly it's been readily acceptable by many, many more advisors. But from my own experience, my wife and I retired pretty well. And, so a lot of people talk to me and ask me what I did. And one of the things I've talked about is reverse mortgage. And Don, as you know, I've sent 1 or 2 people to you that are friends of mine to talk to them about it. My experience is that advisors are much more talking about it and clients are much more readily willing to listen.
Curtis, you've incorporated the Housing Wealth reverse mortgages into your world-class software, Retirement Next Generation.
Yeah,
you've done a lot for the industry, and I appreciate that. How has Housing Wealth led you personally? Because you're a leader in the industry, but you're also a personal planner and you influence a lot of folks. How's Housing Wealth led you to more significant planning conversations around these things, cash flow, risk, liquidity, longevity, things like that?
Yeah, so, there's a case, the first case I think that we referred to an expert on Housing Wealth, and we referred him to you, Don, and your team, was a client that just actually would come back in, and they had a situation where they just didn't save enough money. They bought a house, actually a condominium in a project that had significant tax reductions for the first 6 years, and they really didn't build into their economics the significant increase to their real estate taxes at that location. And by the time that thing increased to its full tax amount, they were in love with the property and where they lived. And so anyway, they just didn't want to sacrifice. And in their situation, they had one parent left, and that parent had a very large life insurance policy, and they were in their 90s, but still in physically decent health, could live a long time, and in fact they did. But we knew that the time was coming to a close within a certain time frame, and they just needed some gap coverage. And so we referred them using Housing Wealth as a stopgap. It's interesting that worked for them. That it created the stopgap. They didn't have to worry. They didn't need all their Housing Wealth. They needed a portion of it, and the parent eventually passed away, and the policy paid out its claim, and of course they were the sole inherited beneficiary of that. And we just simply recently, just as part of their planning, they come in with our software, and we tested taking that lump sum and doing a lot of things with it. But what we found was to give them the longest sustainability was to actually take part of those life insurance proceeds and pay back the Housing Wealth. And they're in their 70s, still fairly young, very healthy, at least one spouse with tremendous longevity, and to get that roll-up factor on the full value of their Housing Wealth back so that the remaining portion of that beneficiary amount could sustain them for a while again, but allow that roll-up benefit of that Housing Wealth, because they had an older contract with a high roll-up, and it was amazing how they could sustain real lifestyle by actually using that Housing Wealth for a period of time, pay it back, not all, but keep that line of credit going and keep that roll-up going, and they could use it again. And if they have another problem come up, they can borrow the money, we can find a way to pay it back. So there could be multiple uses, just like a HELOC loan, that in this case, however, doesn't ever go away, have a contractual lifetime provision in it, and a locked-in roll-up factor. And so it's just really flexible when you're able to add it to a plan. And our software could prove out all the other testing that we did, and by the way, we are fee advisors for analytics. We charge fees for analytics, give analytics, regardless of whether they implement the plan. But when you see the case studies and you see the math and science, it's just a clear winner in those fact patterns. And these clients, made good living, worked for a doctor. One of them was a manager at a GE plant. And so these are good clients and clients, mass affluent, I would call them. And so there's a number of folks that get benefited by this in ways that you wouldn't perceive if you didn't open your ears, open your mind, and then start asking the question.
Thank you, Curtis. One of the concerns
Jim, I've got one more thing to add, if I may. So when I talk to clients, they typically are very vague about how they'll use their assets for income and retirement. So when you talk about the home as an asset, it's usually their most emotional investment or most emotional asset. When they start viewing that as an asset that they can use, it kind of brings things into numbers and not so much emotions. It kind of breaks that barrier a bit, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It does. I'm going to write that down. And there's emotion attached to the home. And wow, Jim, that is fantastic. Another thing that has emotion is just mentioning the reverse mortgage. The typical 7 concerns that advisors have had over, I've been doing this coming up on 20 years with the clients, have these. And the next question has to do with broaching the subject, and I want you to talk about that. But here's some of the concerns that have come up over the years. Reverse mortgages are too complicated. They're too controversial. They're too expensive. One fellow said to me, Don, they're equity strippers. I said, Russ, I don't go to clubs like that, but what's an equity stripper? He said, it doesn't leave any money for the family, the children. I said, well, hold tight. Maybe something has changed. My clients have never asked about a reverse mortgage, and I assure those on the call they have. They probably just never used the name. My clients would never need it, and finally, the most popular was, well, if they need it and if they ask, I would only do it as a last resort. That was popularized by FINRA in their investor alert, and that was FINRA changed their position on that in October 2013. So these are the concerns that advisors have and the clients have. So the next question to you all is, how do you broach the subject with your clients and address their outdated prejudices around reverse mortgages? And before you answer that, and this is very real, isn't it, guys? A fellow called me yesterday, and he said, Don, I was a client. They weren't a client yet, but they were kind of in the process of exploring. And he said to them, well, you should consider reverse mortgage. And he sent them over across town and to somebody and didn't have a solid relationship. They weren't retirement income-focused reverse mortgage people. But the client got offended. The client got offended after he left that meeting, came back and says, I don't want to deal with you because you recommended this reverse mortgage. You sent me over here to Joe Stupid. And that was a bad outcome. And sometimes advisors are afraid of that. One of the things we'll talk about later, that's easy to overcome. But then you just mention reverse mortgages, and sometimes people get a bad feeling or bad tingling in their stomach. Here's the good news for those on the call, that if you work with people who are at or in retirement, here's a fact. 100% of those people have already seen, read, heard, or even inquired about reverse mortgages. They may have outdated information. They certainly may not know who to trust, and you're in a great position. So I'll start with Marshall on this one, then we'll do Curtis and Jim last. How do you broach the subject with your clients or address their outdated prejudices? And Marshall, since you were on the education side, you can answer that in whatever way fits the question.
Sure. Well, the best way I think I can answer is a situation in which I have a friend who was looking to buy a new home and didn't have enough money in the down payment to do it, and responded when I said, look at reverse mortgage with the idea to purchase. And first thing he said was this equity stripper thing. And I said, at your age, you're looking at living another 20 to 30 years, and what you're worried about is equity in 20 or 30 years. As opposed to moving into your dream home for the next 20 years in retirement. I said, this makes no sense to me, not the least of which is you don't understand the reverse mortgage in terms of what you think equity stripping is. So I think that a lot of the ways to broach a subject, and I've talked to some advisors about it as well, is that it is part of the overall plan. It is not an independent subject to be brought up, because isolated by itself, I think that the clients can potentially bring in a lot of negatives. But if it's part of a broad approach, kind of like what Curtis was saying about the clients he just talked about. You have a much better way of enveloping it into the whole process, and when it becomes part of the process of the retirement planning, I think it's much easier to talk about.
So incorporate it and don't isolate it as you bring it up. Thank you. Curtis, how would you broach the subject and address their outdated prejudices?
Yes, I think it's really important how you frame it before you talk about it, so that there's no disregard for bringing it up, or it doesn't create an unfavorable outcome, as was described as you were explaining another advisor's experience. And that's to basically say this. One of the things, Mr. and Mrs. Client, that's really important to me is that you consider all things that would touch your money, touch your life, and be important for you to know. And I think you rely on me to be the expert to bring all those topics to you. And so there's a topic we've not talked about. I haven't a clue if it'd be something that would be applicable to you. And I warn you before I bring it up as a new topic. And I'm not bringing it up because I think necessarily it's something that you would be interested in doing or should be doing, but I bring it up in order to be the one in your life that brings it up before somebody else does, so that you don't think or don't experience that I'm less than fully thorough. And so with that, I'm going to bring up a topic that has a lot of biases against it, and it's one of those things that for many years I would put my fingers in my ears and go, la la, don't tell me, I don't want to know. So let me warn you in advance before I bring it up. We can talk about it and either put it on the shelf, put it away, never talk about it again, or it becomes a prudent aspect in something that you want to explore. And so that's the way we tee and frame up the conversation, as to not offend or risk the relationship or not be seen as maybe we've lost our minds. And people appreciate that tee up, that frame up, and they are always surprised at what they learn. Now, obviously, we're selective on who we discuss this with based upon what we see. We understand fact patterns and so forth. And not everybody that we bring it up with is necessarily going to bite at the opportunity. They'll say, thank you, let's bring it up again. Not everybody is qualified, in my mind, in that they're not in the last home they're going to buy. There's expected a transition where they're going to downsize or move to a different city. Well, that would just be premature to consider housing wealth or a reverse mortgage until they'd settled into what they perceive, my opinion, to their last home. So a number of responses and reactions occur, and oftentimes when you bring it up, they bring it back up a year or two later. So it's really, it's all in how you frame it when you bring it up.
Thank you, Curtis. Framing, sharing your personal testimony, how you got involved with it, getting permission is and being selective. Now, Jim, you broaching the subject, and the reason I invited Jim Hefner on this call, there are about 16,000 advisors that are working their way through the RICP curriculum that I teach in, and I've got a lot of personal contact with them. And I told Jim, I said, Jim, out of all of these advisors over 20 years, you have been the one that have had clients respond the most out of anyone I know in the United States. And so when he first started, and he was broaching the subject, and it was so fascinating, I actually went to Charlotte to hang out with him because I wanted to see what in the world is this guy doing. Jim, how did you broach the subject, and how do you do it now with your clients that addresses some of their outdated prejudices?
Don, first thing, I want to build a relationship. I want to feel comfortable that I've established enough trust and credibility that whatever I say, they're going to listen to me with open ears and believe that there is some grain of truth there. So it's not the first thing I'm going to bring up, for sure. And it's not the thing that I do to make myself money, obviously. So it's not the first topic that we talk about. But it's done at a point where there's a relationship already established. And I think the setting the stage comes from having a conversation about mortgages in general. I'm a real believer that leverage is a good thing if you're up for it. So if anytime I can get a mortgage for 3 or 4% and make 6 or 7, I want a mortgage. I want all the money I can borrow for as long as I can borrow it. So I think people they're just taught, pay that home off as soon as you can. Okay, now you're retired, now you have no tax deduction, what do you do? Is it a good decision or not? Well, everyone's different. But I think setting up the comparison or bringing a mortgage into the conversation as a tool, not an evil thing that you have to have when you're young. I mean, when you're young, you could buy a home with cash, but living in a doghouse isn't very exciting, right? So you can use leverage to get a much nicer home. So leverage isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. With a reverse mortgage, it's even better because there's no payments to make. So if they get the idea of leverage, now it's like, well, that's just another step in the process.
And we'll come back to, thank you, Jim, for that. And there's certainly, you don't have to go very far to mention reverse mortgages and get a reaction. I think the most powerful thing is, as we go through today, there'll be some resources to educate yourself. But broaching the subject is very wise. I encourage advisors to do exactly what you heard these gentlemen talk about. How do you frame it? Beginning to, I say, let's frame it in the context of planning. Longevity, liquidity, legacy, long-term care, lifestyle, all of the 5 concerns that retirees have. And then you've taken their pulse. How concerned are you about this or that? And a lot of times I say to them, one of my favorite questions is, you're in front of a client and they have a big mortgage payment. And there's a fella that had a client, they were drawing out money from the investment, and they still had this $1,400 a month mortgage payment, and he thought a reverse mortgage would be good. And he simply said to them, you should consider a reverse mortgage. And they were offended, and because they had some outdated prejudices. And what I said to him, I said, let's frame that a little differently. You talk to them where the pressure is, how are you doing at your current withdrawal rate, and you find the pain point, and you say to them something like this: if there was a way, or what would retirement be like, Bob and Sally, if you didn't have to make that $1,400 a month mortgage payment? Now, they're going to say to you, either it's great, I don't mind making it, but the majority of folk are going to say, whew, it'll be great. And you say to them, why would it be great? What would you do? And they say, well, Jim, I would do A, B, C, D, and E. You say, fantastic. You explore that. And then you say something like this. Here's framing it. Here's what Curtis and Marshall talked about. If there's a way for you to eliminate your monthly mortgage payment in order that you could do A, B, C, D, and E, would you want me to talk to you about that? Now, that's a whole different way of framing that. And so that's one of the things that we share. And now, compliance. This next question is, what has your experience?
Don,
yeah.
Don, could I jump in before we leave that topic and just say, what's really cool is when you have software that considers dynamic tax, what tier Medicare Part B and IRMAA costs would be considered based on A solution versus B versus C versus D and E. You're testing every conceivable product and every conceivable combination, and then you're adding to the conversation housing wealth. Every single question that a client may have about, well, I really want to think about that, but what about this? What about that? And what about something else? And what's really cool is when you have dynamic software and you can say, well, let's go look at that. And what you start doing is a process of elimination that says, which one gives you the most of the things that you want and meet the most of your goals? And there's 26 strategies that we talk about with housing wealth with clients that fit that. And it's really cool that when you don't just have to tell them something, then they have to rely on you to believe based on their relationship with you, but you can actually take into math and science and say, well, let's just see what the numbers have to say. And they start making their own conclusions once they start to expand their understanding. So it's just a great place to say, I don't know how anybody does this with a yellow pad and a pen anymore. And some opinion. I think you've got to have software that really frames this question. Clients make their own decisions based on what they see. So
yeah. So hold on, Curtis. I got to give Elise a message. Elise, please throw away my yellow pad and pen. There. And AAA, to the listeners, you know what AAA stands for? Not the American Automobile Association. It stands for All Available Assets. That's what retirement income planning has to take into account, all available assets. Housing wealth is typically 50 to 68% of the total wealth of the client. So if you have a calculator like Curtis's excellent Retirement Next Gen, you're having a conversation, or it's just common sense, having that conversation, broaching the subject, and using your testimony as an advisor to say, I've discovered some things about reverse mortgages I didn't know. And just look at your client. And if they look, they're going to wait to see what you're going to say, because they may say, oh, those things are gross, right? And because they don't know, that's nervous energy in the room, but you'll be surprised. Now, the question of compliance has come up more and more, And I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but things are changing. Mutual of Omaha just purchased the largest distributed retail reverse mortgage company in the country, Retirement Funding Solution, my partner company. And there are others that are, I can't talk about on this call, but there are other broker-dealers and compliance and that are getting into the space. Someone just emailed me right before the call and said, Don, I just got exciting news from my broker-dealer. Can we talk about it? But Curtis and Marshall, and Jim, what has your experience been with compliance been like? Now, whether you're under a broker-dealer or an insurance manufacturer, some listening would say, Don, my suitability for placing this annuity says, does your client even have a reverse mortgage? And I got a decline. I couldn't do that. And so compliance comes in a lot of ways. What have you encountered? How are you overcoming that? What would you share with the people? And I'll start with you, Jim, and then Curtis, and then Marshall can chime in, please.
So Don, I really have nothing to contribute there. I've had no issues I'm aware of that are compliance issues regarding this.
Okay. Curtis and Marshall?
So, yeah, well, I've had some experiences with this, and I recently was interviewed by RMD Magazine in the reverse mortgage space, and I think there are a number of things that I see that become hurdles in this arena, though I think many of those hurdles are starting to be overcome, and one of them is just, you know, each of us have a job. Compliance people have biases to these terms as well, and so when you're given the authority by FINRA and the SEC as the broker-dealer or the registered investment advisor firm to decide what you approve in your shop or not approve in your shop, it makes it pretty easy if you have a personal bias to mask the bias by just saying, just not going to allow it, and it's not allowed. That would be one thing. Second thing is that they hide behind the E&O coverage issue, that, well, our E&O doesn't cover if we do reverse mortgages. But what we're talking about here is advisors, is not being a reverse mortgage expert in that we're originating loans. We're talking about framing it in the retirement plan and knowing when to pass the baton as a referral to a reverse mortgage expert. So we're not selling reverse mortgages. We just are a fiduciary that's capable of having the conversation mathematically as it relates to the economics of that particular client situation. So the E&O is not an issue as long as you understand we're not selling these products. We're framing these products as fiduciaries and the model. And then thirdly, it's really an advice issue. So this is really an issue under the, I would think the 65 license in the RIA space more than anything, in that we're really being paid a fee to give advice. And so it really fits under what I call the advice guise of our services. So if we understand that our fiduciary role here in the rule, we don't have to, we get rid of our biases, we can get past the E&O. By the way, we should get the E&O carriers to understand the importance of fiduciary standards and make sure that that we're not limiting the contracts that make that mucky or cloudy, but we clear that issue up. So I know we have some work to do, not just with BDs and registered investment advisors, but also with insurance carriers that protect the firms that need that E&O coverage. But really, when you drill down to the advice issue, it's not an issue. As long as we're keeping the advisors on the advice side, we're keeping the originators and the reverse mortgage experts on the other side, I really don't think there's a whole lot of issue here as long as we understand what it is that we're really talking about.
And times are changing, and things are going in a different direction. We've got about 15 minutes left. Marshall, I want to hold off on this because you've got a story that I want to share. But one of the foundations that we've talked about on this call, the listeners, and it's included in the course, is this HECM line of credit, which has a built-in guaranteed growth factor. Today it's about 5.5%. Cannot be frozen, canceled, or reduced. It's not based off your income, assets, or credit. It's not tied into the value of the home. And so $200,000 home, $400,000, $600,000 home. I just wanted to put this on the screen that shows because you've heard the panelists talk about this. So here's a reverse mortgage. I think when I did this, the person was 68 years of age. And it says now the first one, the $200,000 home, over 30 years, it grew to $381. The $400,000 home grew to $781. Another one grew to nearly $1.2 million. The principle is that you've got a built-in guaranteed growth factor for these things, and how can that be used in the retirement income planning space? I want to show, again, this line of credit, but it can be converted to a monthly payment. So here's a client, $400,000 home, age 65, the line of credit was 162, but if they took a monthly payment, it would be 857. Now notice what happens as they just let it grow. Now here we're in year 15, they're 80 years of age. They say, now I want to turn my line of credit into a monthly payment. Notice how much it is, and we'll go out here until they're 90. The line of credit grew, and you can turn it on to a monthly payment at any time. So these are two very powerful concepts. There are 5 foundations, the monthly payment and the line of credit are 2. But when you think about this in the context of the flexibility that it gives you as a financial advisor, it really begins to open up some conversations. Marshall, you actually did a reverse mortgage. You have one, a line of credit, and you were not poor or desperate. You were well off. You were a professional. You have designations. You help professional. Why in the world did you and your wife choose to do a reverse mortgage for yourselves?
Well, thank you, Don. In the interest of time, I know you're going to ask me about how I broach costs. So let me do those two with this one and speed up a little bit of time for you.
Okay.
First of all, it was the total. First of all, let me start by saying that if you go back to one of the early slides you had, where you had the different kinds of clients, I clearly am one of the carefree group where I have a solid retirement plan with the capacity to weather most any storm. So, like you said, why buy it? When I looked at the totality of the benefits of it, it just guaranteed that my plan would work no matter what. Whether I needed it or not, it was nice to have it there. So my wife and I made the decision to buy that based on the fact that the totality of benefits that we got out of it was so far worth the process and the cost that it made no sense not to do it. And I have my own figures with me right off of my own paperwork.
Okay.
My wife, when I bought it, when we bought it, I was 70, turning 70, my wife was 64. As you know, and most people know, if a couple in America, both people make it to age 65, there is a 90% or more chance that probably that one of them will live another 30 years. Now, assuming I'm 5 years older than my wife, men die before women anyway, generally, my wife would be the one to make it. It cost us about $4,000 to put this in play. And you might say, well, why spend $4,000 if you didn't need it? Well, follow the game plan. If my wife was 64, which she was, and she's going to make it to age 90 with a high probability of doing it, the value of that account becomes $485,000. $485,000. Now, if I took that $4,000 and invested it, and God was good to me, and I got 10% a year, it would double every 7 years. Well, that's 4 doublings. That takes my $4,000 and makes it $64,000. Jim, you got a lot of, if you got it to sell, I'll give you as many $4,000 clumps as I can give you if you'll give my wife back $480,000, when she turns 90 years old. That's what I viewed it as why I spend that money. If I needed it earlier, I could use it earlier, using Curtis's example of running up against something I didn't anticipate, a big expense that I didn't expect. I had to put a roof on my house or whatever it is, a new roof on my house, and I've got that to tap into. If you go along with which I do believe in that concept of pots of money that you invest in different ways over the time. You have the one pot that is a 20 or 30-year investment pot. It enabled me, as I've heard Curtis say many times, be very, very risk-taking with that 30-year pot, because no matter what happens, I'm looking at $400,000 plus in that 30-year range. Mm-hmm. And even if my wife doesn't make it, even if I make it and I'm older than her, it drops down to, when I'm 90, $330,000. How can you turn that away? How can you not look at that and realize that there is a benefit there that you can't walk away from? So I guess in answer to sum up, it was the totality of all the benefits, the fact that it guaranteed everything I planned would work no matter what happened, because the last thing I'll add is this is an unrelated, uncorrelated asset that grows independent from every other asset I have and everything that I can do to mess it up by making bad investment choices with my pots of money. So it guaranteed that in every phase of whatever I did, whatever came my way, whatever I couldn't weather as the storm, I was able to weather it with the reverse mortgage. And that leads to the last point, which is peace of mind. My wife is very conservative in investments. I'm not like that. The peace of mind she gets every time she looks at that number back, when she gets older, is very soothing to her, and she sleeps very comfortably at night knowing that it's there no matter what happens. So that in total is why we bought it.
Thank you, Marshall. That was excellent. I hope you all heard that real good. What I want to do here is, Curtis, the question I had for you, I think you've covered a little bit. How do you see housing wealth impacting the clients you serve? And what fact patterns do you think best define clients who may benefit? And you covered a lot of that. Would you like to add anything to that?
Yes.
I want to get to some of the questions.
I think the fact pattern is trying to get people to see I call this an equity flexibility strategy. It's not an equity stripper. It just creates a lot of flexibility and a lot of choice between the investable portfolio and the housing wealth portion of their total portfolio, and being able to pick and choose and have a lot of flexibility over time. And the only way I can truly give a client the maximum flexibility is to start that reverse mortgage as young as possible, because even if we utilize some of the housing wealth before the line of credit is equal to or greater than the value of the home, our intention traditionally, not in every situation, is to not cannibalize the value of the home by taking a line of credit permanently too soon. And so that requires us to have a home we think we're going to live in a long time and be able to have a long roll-up period to be able to take advantage of that, and then have the flexibility to use it on and off and pay it back over time. And so fact pattern is trying to get people to identify people as young as possible, identify people with the home that they truly believe they're going to stay in, and it's the last home they're in, and then being able to have that conversation. So those are the fact patterns, the general fact patterns that we see, and we never know in life what's going to be dealt our way, and so it's being able to give maximum flexibility.
Fantastic. I want to invite the folks who are on the call. If you've got some questions, I want you to type them in. It'll take about 60 to 90 seconds to get to me. We've got some questions here because I want to. Now the questions, if you've got some reverse mortgage specific questions, you can go to Housing Wealth Mini Course and I'll answer those. If you've got questions that are advisor related, advisor focused, then I want Jim, Curtis, and Marshall to do that. Jim, what's the biggest objection people have to reverse mortgages that you have experienced?
When I meet them, they really have none. They just have a blanket view that they shouldn't do it. Right? It's like annuities. They've heard they're bad, but they have no idea why. They don't know how they work.
Right.
So once they understand them, either they can make sense of it or not. It's a fit for them or not. But I think they value it, and the objections come out of their particular situation. If that makes sense.
I think that's true, Jim. Absolutely. Absolutely. And Marshall talked about the cost. We've got some audience questions now. I want you to take a minute. While you're sending the questions, I want to give you a few resources that I think and have found very, very important, some education resources. I want to thank the sponsor, Insurance WebEx, for putting this on. I do 4 of these a year for Insurance WebEx, and I appreciate that. And but there are some resources that you may find valuable. Let me share 4, and then I'll take your questions, and we'll share with the panel. I wrote a book called Housing Wealth. It reached the Amazon bestseller in a new category for about 33 minutes, and I was able to capture that for 33 minutes. But you can find out more at housingwealthbook.com. I cover all of these questions, and the Housing Wealth book is actually a summary of all 18 chapters, as you can see. I'm creating a guilt-free retirement with the HECM 4326 replacement. That graph over there says the early years of spending, the go-go years, are where people spend more, but often there's a gap in what they desire to spend and what they're budgeted to spend, and we talk about how to replace that gap, as well as I think we do 11 or 12 case studies in there. So that's a resource that you want to make available. The second are some educational tools here. 25 ways to use a reverse mortgage. This comes from Investment News. 12 smart, savvy ways to use a reverse mortgage. Forbes had an article, 5 ways a reverse mortgage can improve a retirement income plan. And the American College had an articles called Making the Case for Reverse Mortgages and Retirement Income Conversations. I'm on the second page of that. Dr. Robert C. Merton, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, is on the front page of that. Now, this is important because they're not sales tools. They're not promoting a company. They're education tools for advisors to use. You keep out of the murky waters when you keep it educational. Now, today we're not going to talk about Social Security optimization, tax bracket management, Roth conversions, RMDs, estate and Medicaid planning, market sequence risks, lifestyle bridge, college funding, long-term care. All of these are covered, a lot in the book, but the course, the Housing Wealth Certified Advisor course that I teach, a lot of it was filmed at the American College. We do that over about a 4-hour period where we take you start to finish. We give you the questions, language, concepts, strategies to use to help you impact your clients and grow your practice. It's a Housing Wealth Mini Course. You can get that. Please go. It's free today. It won't be free after a few days. You'll have to register and pay, but for you all, it's free today. And if you got any more questions for me, please write this down. Ask Don Graves at Gmail. If you're interested in the course or any of the materials I just mentioned, you'll have to email me, Ask Don Graves at Gmail, or the person who invited you, and they'll get that to you. So some audience questions here, and we'll land the plane here shortly. Uh-oh, where'd I go there? Okay. These were sent in beforehand. A key barrier keeping advisors from talking about housing wealth is errors and omission insurance, which doesn't protect from reverse mortgages. Where do we even start with that challenge? Linda wrote that in, and Curtis Cloak expertly talked about that reverse mortgages are really at the smoke screen, and that it's not an E&O issue, as Curtis talked about. So Linda, I think we covered it. Jim said, another Jim, what's the most common aspect or part of your business that you believe most reverse specialists do not understand? That's an interesting question. You guys want to tackle that? This person's saying, what don't we understand about your business?
Hey, Don, I have a hard stop here at 1 o'clock, another webinar I'm to be on with clients. So I apologize. So feel free to email me questions I can participate in, but I will have to cease the webinar at this moment and start another one up here. I apologize.
Okay, thanks, Curtis, for being with us. And I'll give, everyone will get a follow-up email, and Curtis, if it's okay, I'll just let them email you any questions. So Jim, and we've got about 4 or 5 minutes here because we started about 5 after. Would you like to take that? Or Mark?
So Don, I'm not quite clear on how to interpret the question. Is he asking, do you think, what is it about my business as an advisor that you or someone who does reverse mortgages doesn't understand?
Yes, that's what he's asking.
Well, one might think that in a way it seems irrelevant to what we do. We're not making any money on a reverse mortgage, so why focus on it? Mm-hmm. So sometimes it takes a back burner to our real day-to-day jobs. But I think the value is, giving full planning to a client, doing what's best for the client, and in the end, knowing that your client will be in a better place, having better cash flow, less pressure on your plan that you've done, and greater success. And I think the ultimate result is that your client has greater respect for you when you go through the dark places and pull out great products that they can appreciate. Beyond that, Don, I'm not sure what else I would say.
Yeah.
Marshall?
And
well, it's hard to say because my relationship with advisors doesn't necessarily always talk about reverse mortgages. But the questions I get from clients, which I think are the things that that an advisor should focus on, is not understanding that it is just a mortgage. Number one. Number two, not understanding the fees. I've had 1 or 2 people tell me the fees were too high for what they thought they could accomplish with it, which, as I said, I don't understand that, but that's what they said. So I think that it's just, in some ways, it's just a general understanding of what an advisor is going to get their most questions on and making sure they know the answers to them quickly and not have to think about it too much and not have to go ask somebody else for the answer to it. So I suspect that's it, but again, I'm not in the business, so I can't tell you what my practice would be like.
Sure, great. Here are a few questions. Let me read them. Someone says, Art had mentioned, quote, "It's always there." Is that true? I think we're talking about the line of credit. I don't think it was there during the financial meltdown. Art, most lines of credit from a commercial bank or lender can be frozen, canceled, or reduced. A reverse mortgage cannot be frozen, canceled, or reduced as long as you meet the qualifications of the loan, which are live in the property, take care of it, pay your taxes and insurance. That's what makes it very, very different from the line of credit, is that it is there during the financial meltdown, and it cannot be frozen, canceled, or reduced, and the growth is guaranteed. That's fantastic. Jay had asked a question, is if a reverse mortgage allows an advisor's client to retain more of their managed asset for the advisor, does it not mean that it helps the advisor continue to make more money? That comes from Jay. And it seems, Marshall and Jim, Jay is saying, hey, if you have set, and one of the ways to use a reverse mortgage to those listening is you can set it up as a buffer asset that during down cycles, the client doesn't have to take money from their investments and cannibalize and lock in the loss. They can take it from an alternative source like a reverse mortgage. If you do that, they're going to retain more assets under management. And doesn't that mean if the advisor's getting paid that way, doesn't that mean they make more money? I would say, Jay, the answer is yes. Maybe the underlying question is that a conflict, Marshall or Jim?
Jim here.
Go ahead, Jim.
Go ahead, Marshall.
I was just going to say, it doesn't appear to me to be a conflict. The fact that somebody does something with one advisor. I mean, I look at me, as I said, with me. My wife is very conservative. I'm much more risk-taking in my investments. My wife no longer argues with me about that pot that I'm investing for our long-term future because she's got her safety pot of the reverse mortgage. Now, is somebody making money because I'm investing more aggressively and turning money over and doing the things I do? Yeah, but so what? That has nothing to do with the reverse mortgage that I purchased, at least not in my opinion.
Sure.
So Jim here, I think the SEC is okay with us making fees on performance. So as an IAR or IIA, when our client has more wealth in the pot and we get the same percentage, we make more money and the client has more wealth, and that seems to work fine. So I don't see any problem with a plan that helps the client have more wealth because he's able to use this risk-free asset, in this case a home equity line or a HECM, to turn to keep his money that's in the market, give it time to recover before he spends in that bucket. So to me, it's a great tool to use. I do think there's other ways to use the HECMs that can be very beneficial, like you referred to it briefly, Don, about doing Roth conversions using that money from the home. So a lot of ways to do that we didn't get into, but I think they can all be beneficial to the client.
Marshall, were you saying something?
Oh, I was just saying yes. I mean, I totally agree with what Jim said.
We're at the landing space. Our trays are up and our seat backs are in the upright position as we land home. Let me give the resources again. Thanking Insurance WebEx for allowing me to present this, and the Housing Wealth book. It's the only book of its kind because it's written for the advisor. It's not an academic book. It's a pracademic. Because I walked in your shoes. You need to know the language, concepts, stories in order to help you. It's got 18 chapters. All of them are written for the advisor. You can find out more at Housing Wealth Book. You can see what's in the chapters. I commend that to you. I really do. If you want the 4 and a PDF of these 4 articles, education articles, email the person who invited you and say, Don, I want those. I want those. You can email me at Ask Don Graves. Some of the things we didn't get to. The course we're teaching, we really unpack this over 4 hours, and I get to be your coach and mentor for 6 months to a year. It's really fantastic. We're finishing up now. You'll be delighted. Make sure you get the Housing Wealth Mini course. That's free. You can watch that, and every concept we've covered in there, so you'll get it. But for more information, you can just email askdongraves@gmail.com. My assistant will get that, and we'll get to you everything you wanted. Marshall and Jim, do you have any closing comments before we land the plane?
Yeah, I just have one comment, and that is that my experience, because as I said, my son is my financial advisor, and Don, I know you and I talked about it once. I kind of brushed him off when he first brought it up because had all those negative connotations of the early impressions of reverse mortgages. And he came to me and insisted I look closer at it, and I'm forever grateful for that. But he made a comment that was great, and that was that if he gets it wrong, I'm going to wind up living with him. And he doesn't want that. His wife doesn't want that. My wife doesn't want it, and I don't want it. Now, that's not true of every advisor, but the reality is if you don't give good advice, if you don't incorporate every possible way that a client can survive retirement, then I think an advisor is remiss in their duties and their job and their responsibilities to their clients. And I think the other thing is if you bring it up whether they buy it or not, nobody else can come in behind you and convince them of it and take your business away from you, because there's somebody out there that's got a good idea on how to use a reverse mortgage. So I think it's just a benefit to everybody. Jim, it's your
great points, Marshall. To me, I think that there's, cash is king. And when you need cash, nothing else will do. So if you haven't made available to the client or shown him how he can access all of his assets to get that last bit of cash he might need, we haven't done our job for the client.
Those are good final words, folks. We're on the tarmac. We're pulling up to the gate to exit this flight. We've had a super time here with conversation with 3 advisors, thought leaders, about the role of housing wealth in their practice and in their personal life. There's a recording of this that will be made available to you. Any of the resources that you saw on the screen, email the person who invited you, or you can email me and we'll make those available to you. Marshall and Jim and Curtis, who has gone to the next call, I appreciate you all. Bye for now.